The Forgotten Fire: How India's Soldiers Shook the British Empire, the untold story of the Indian Armed Forces and the final collapse of colonial rule. The Indian freedom struggle has often been narrated as a tale of moral resistance, political negotiations, and non-violent defiance. But buried beneath this narrative lies another, more explosive truth, a truth forged not in peaceful protest but in the silent defiance of men in uniform. These were the soldiers, sailors, and airmen of the British Indian forces who, though sworn to the Crown, found themselves torn between duty and nationhood. Their actions between 1942 and 46, culminating in the Royal Indian Navy Mutiny, the Jabalpur Revolt, and widespread discontent in the ranks, did what decades of diplomacy could not. They broke the spine of the British Raj from within. The Indian Army, once regarded as the steel pillar of imperial control, was itself undergoing a moral revolution. The soldiers, largely drawn from humble Indian backgrounds, had fought in two world wars under a flag that was not their own. They had seen the hypocrisy of empire firsthand, fighting for freedom in Europe while being denied it at home. When nationalists' favor spread through the subcontinent, it was not confined to universities or political circles. It seeped into barracks, mess halls, and parade grounds. Soldiers quietly passed around pamphlets, listened to Congress speeches in secret, and began to question the purpose of their loyalty. Historical accounts reveal how even prominent officers like General K. S. Thimaiya, Lieutenant General S. P. S. Thorat, and Major General Nathu Singh struggled with the tension between duty to their regiment and duty to the motherland. The nationalist movement was no longer an abstract idea, it was a living force that entered the psyche of men who carried rifles and wore khaki. Motilal Nehru's advice to Thimaiya that India would soon need trained military men after independence became prophetic. The Indian officers maintained discipline not because they supported the British cause but because they foresaw their future role in a free nation. But while the army held its silence, the navy erupted. On February 18, 1946, the sailors of HMIS Talwar in Bombay struck the first spark of rebellion. What began as a protest against poor conditions and racial discriminations quickly evolved into a full-scale mutiny. Ships across Bombay, Karachi, Madras, and Calcutta hoisted the tricolour, replaced the Union Jack. The sailors referred to themselves as members of the Indian National Navy, raised slogans of Jai Hind and Vande Mataram. This was not an isolated insurrection. It was a national awakening within the ranks. The revolt soon spread across 20 shore establishments and 70 ships, involving nearly 30,000 sailors. The spirit of revolt was contagious. Airmen in Karachi and Pune refused to follow orders. Clerks in army headquarters went on strike. Signal corpsmen in Jabalpur mutinied in solidarity. The Jabalpur uprising of February 26, 1946 was particularly symbolic. When the men of the Indian Royal Navy Signal Corps turned against their superiors, they were not merely rebelling against order, they were revolting against an empire that had humiliated them. The retaliation was swift and brutal. British regiments charged with bayonets, killing and injuring dozens. Yet the psychological impact was irreversible. The British realized that their most reliable weapon, the Indian soldier, could no longer be trusted. Within weeks, the colonial establishment understood what no Round Table Conference had achieved. The Indian Royal Navy Mutiny was not merely a military rebellion, it was the Empire's death certificate. British intelligence cables, later declassified, revealed that the Commander-in-Chief, Field Marshal Claude Auchinleck, warned London of an immediate breakdown of military discipline. He admitted that the British could not hold India without the cooperation of Indian troops, a cooperation that was vanishing fast. In private communications, British Prime Minister Clement Attlee acknowledged that the erosion of loyalty among the Indian forces was the principal reason for advancing independence from 1948 to 1947. The irony is that these soldiers, sailors, airmen who hastened the empire's fall received no place of honor in official independence histories. Their defiance was too violent for a narrative dominated by non-violence. Post-independence, the political leadership preferred to immortalize satyagraha rather than mutiny. Yet for historians and military scholars, the facts are undeniable. The armed forces' disobedience was the final trigger that forced the British withdrawal. The empire that once claimed to rule by discipline collapsed the moment its enforcers began to think as Indians. The rebellion of 1946 also revealed a profound transformation in the Indian mind, the convergence of Indian soldiers and citizens, patriot and professional. It was no longer possible for an India to serve the crown without moral conflict. Gandhi, Nehru, Lala Lajpat Rai had all advised young officers to stay in service until independence came, but when that moment arrived, it came through the same men they had cautioned. Their restraint had preserved the skeleton of a future national defense force, but the awakening had made the British retreat inevitably. After the mutiny was suppressed, thousands of soldiers and sailors were dismissed, imprisoned, or blacklisted. Yet their sacrifice echoed across generations. Clement Attlee, in a private conversation years later, admitted that the loyalty of the Indian Army, Navy, and Air Force had completely broken down, and that was a real reason for British departure. Nicholas Mansurk, historian of the British transfer of power, later described it as the final unraveling of imperial control. The forgotten fire that burnt in those ships and barracks didn't die with surrender. It became the moral foundation of the Indian Armed Forces of independent India, proud, disciplined, and loyal to the nation rather than a foreign crown. These were not mercenaries, they were men who chose duty over rebellion, until rebellion itself became duty. Today, the echoes of that defiance survive in the silence of war memorials, in the discipline of modern regiments, and in the flame of Amar Jawan Jyoti. The 1946 mutiny and the Jabalpur Revolt, and the quiet courage of officers who resisted orders to fire on their countrymen, all represent a truth that history books rarely teach, that freedom was not merely granted, it was seized quietly by those who had held the empire's guns and chose to lower them. The Forgotten Fire is not merely a chapter in military history, it is the story of a nation's conscience awakening under uniform. It is a tale of men who learn that true duty lies not in obedience but in justice, that the mightiest empire can be undone when its soldiers remember where they come from.